Good morning, William Jewell College community. It's Craig Walls here again from the campus of William Jewell College. This is my third devotion I think that I've done, and I think we're going to move to monthly devotions after this. But I wanted to offer one more short little word here, if I could. Today, I was thinking about the fact. We're obviously in our moment here, and no one's on campus, and it's so weird to be living here without the students at this time of year, as spring is broken here on the campus. But I was thinking about every person today that runs a business or manages a business, large or small, from the largest corporations like Boeing or Disney to just the person down on the square just down the road here who can't be open. Every nonprofit organization, every small college, even to the large universities, every church, every restaurant, every hotel. They are worried right now. Everyone's worried about how do we survive these next few months? How do we make payroll? How do we help our employees? How do we continue to do business or our jobs in this environment? And when is it going to let up? There's this fear that is everywhere. And it's not just the fear of getting sick, which that's a huge issue in and of itself, but this fear of what the virus is doing to our life and our community and how we relate to one another. And I want to share that early on in my church plant in Nebraska, which was nearly 2 decades ago, before we came to Jewell, I served as a minister. I helped plant a church. I worked there. I did that for 16 years before we came here. I came across a passage very early on in that ministry that offered me personally a word of hope and a real word of challenge that also left me with a visible daily reminder of God's provision and God's presence in the world, even in the most dire of circumstances. And the story comes from the Hebrew Scriptures, from 1 Kings chapter 17. And it's the story of Elijah and the widow. And in the story, God sends this desperate and defeated Elijah, who is the greatest of all prophets in Israel. And at this time, he's really down. And in the midst of a famine and a drought, and everything is just depressed everywhere, very similar to what we're dealing with here. And in that, God sends Elijah to this encounter with a woman, a widow. And to the reader, as we read it, it's an absurd thing that God would send Elijah to her, because he asks her to give him something to eat, to feed him, and to give him something to drink. So he shows up at her home and he asks for something to eat and something to drink. And here is the very real and truthful response that the widow gives to Elijah. I want you to hear this. She says to him, after he asks that question, she says, "As the Lord your God lives, Elijah, I have nothing baked. I only have a handful of meal in a jar, a little jug of oil, and I'm now gathering a couple of sticks so that I can go home and prepare it for myself and my son, so that we may eat it," and then listen to this, "and then die." God has sent Elijah to a woman who is actually in as bad a situation or a worse situation than he is. She is down to her last meal. She is facing this reality of death for her and her son, which you can only imagine the pain and anguish that she is facing. As you read the text, it's heartbreaking, it's real. And into this despair, Elijah speaks a word from God to her, a word of hope. He tells her that if she makes him a cake first, that the Lord will never allow her jar of meal to go empty, that it will always be full. So, in this word from God, the widow now has a very difficult decision to make. Is she going to trust what she sees with her eyes, what is right before her, what everything in the world around her is saying right now, that there's death and despair and that this is all that there is? Or is she going to trust what Elijah says, that God will make a way for her? She must decide if she's going to trust her lived experience, which is very real, or if she's going, as Elijah says, to trust the Lord. Well, we know the story. In the story, she trusts the Lord, and her jug of oil and her jar of meal never do go dry. Even though the story gets much more complicated, it's never as simple as that, and she has more struggle, but she endures, and her son endures in the long run. And I found this passage, and I came across this very early in my work in that church in Nebraska almost 2 decades ago, when we were not facing a pandemic and not facing a great economic crisis that we all are right now. But early in that work, even not as we were in those type of things, although it was right after September 11th that we started there in Nebraska, I realized that our entire lives, whether you're in ministry or whatever you're doing in life, whatever your job or vocation is, our entire lives are really about, are we going to trust God with our lives and our life? Are we going to trust in this greater thing that is bigger than us, or just in what we can see in the moment? And even in, I think, our community's good days, when there is no virus, I think that's the challenge of our life, is to believe that our life and our resources are more than what is currently before us, more than we can simply see, that God is not going to let our jars and jugs go empty, literally and metaphorically. I'm also struck that God sends Elisha, the greatest prophet in all of Israel, to such a lowly widow with virtually nothing. It's really interesting that in these texts, in these Hebrew texts, that God finds life in the midst of the least of these. The greatest prophet in all of Israel survives by the hand of the least in Israel. And there is a good word for us right now, as we are all surviving because of people who traditionally in our society, grocery workers, are not thought of as the greatest in our society, and yet they are the ones that are keeping us alive during this time. The story in 1 Kings, as I said, found me early on in our startup when we had very few resources, and we had to trust that God was going to make a way for us in Nebraska and with this church and in life in general. Even when there were times that it looked like there was no way, that there was death and drought and everything that could go wrong would go wrong. And so what I did early on in that ministry, I filled a jar, a little jug like this with meal, and I put this on my bookshelf or on my desk. And it has been there for the last almost 17, it's now almost 19 years. It came here to Missouri with us. And it's an ever-present reminder that God's promises are secure, that God's provision is secure. And it tells me, and I hope it can share with you, that in all things, in all circumstances, in all that life throws at us, that God redeems us and gives us life and new life and faith to get through everything we endure in life. So I wish you blessings to the Jewell community this week, and I will hopefully see you another time here in a month or so. Take care.